The ninth generation of consoles is weird, isn't it? At least when you discuss the business tactics of Sony and Microsoft. Minimal exclusivity and the odd choice to release first-party games on the PC. This seems like an odd business choice to make. I, like many, was wondering why they probably do it. Don't exclusives sell consoles? Why are all Microsoft exclusives on PC? Well, they win regardless since they are Windows, and if they don't buy an Xbox, they can make money off of it being on PC. But what about Sony? Why is Sony releasing all their first-party games on PC? What's the end game, besides just making more money? Why is it all of a sudden worth it? They could have brought most of their games to PC years ago. Let me explain the nature of Sony's situation. Some of you may be wondering what this weird plate with shapes I'm holding is. It's a resin 3D print. That's because this is also a one-day build, where I try to make something cool in a day. I like to call these a one-day build and chill, like we are just hanging out in the shop working on stuff and talking. Seeing as I'm talking about Sony PlayStation, I figured I'd build a Kratos statue. This is a Kratos vs. Zeus statue I got from Cults 3D, designed by Los Lobos de Porto Viejo. Unfortunately, the file wasn't exactly perfect when I downloaded it, so I had to separate out the file in Mesh Mixer and print it in pieces. Then I glued as many of the pieces as I could and used an accelerator to make the glue dry fast. I also ended up printing the base in plastic as opposed to resin, just because I like the one piece looking aesthetic. I added some Bondo into the gaps to make everything look seamless. Then I hit everything with some primer, then some black paint, and then glued it all together. Finally, I used a little more black paint to hide glue spots and hit it all with rub and buff. Sony is by far the oddest of all console developers because they have won the most console generations in terms of sales, not due to their competence or innovation, but due to their competitors' incompetence and mistakes. Essentially succeeding due to luck more than skill. However, this luck might finally be running out. Sony has always seemed to be a company that has fallen headfirst into victory. When they released the PS1, it was purely out of spite to Nintendo. They were originally going to team up to produce a new disc-based console called the Nintendo PlayStation. Then Nintendo decided to not use CDs last minute, prior to a press event mind you, and that made Sony mad enough to go and make their own console. I know it sounds like I made that up, but I didn't. While arguably less powerful than the N64, they sold more games on the PS1 because it was CD based, which allowed more space for game development versus Nintendo 64 cartridges, which were flash based, 700 megabytes versus 12 megabytes. Not even the best programmers could shrink a 700 megabyte game down to 1/58th its size. Then they released the PS2 and made it DVD compatible and sold it at a fraction of the price of a DVD player, at the time letting them build a big install base. Nintendo's GameCube finally switched over to CD, but of course they needed to make their input proprietary by using a mini disc that still held less data than their competition. Xbox became a thing, but being a newcomer in the market without a killer feature didn't exactly make them sell that much more than a GameCube. Oddly enough, the PS2 was the hardest of the three to program for, but it goes to show you that people would develop for anything if the install base is large enough. This may have led to the attitude they had with the PS3. They fell victim to the third console curse, where companies usually make mistakes. Due to their success during the PS2 era, Sony appeared to think they could do as they want and people would just march lockstep with them. They utilized a processor few were able to effectively use even towards the end of the console lifecycle, which made a lot of developers prioritize the Xbox 360 over them. Sony used the same PS2 tactics of including the new method of watching movies at the time, the Blu-ray player, and marketing it below the price of other Blu-ray players at the time. It seemed like they thought, hey, being the go-to multimedia device worked for PS2, so it would work now. We of course beat all of them by a huge margin and was sold at a slight profit by default versus the other two consoles being an overclocked GameCube. At the end of the generation, Sony ended up selling more units on the Xbox 360. Granted, I suspect Xbox were profitable since they charged for online gaming while Sony did not at the time. They got lucky again with the release of the PS4 because of Xbox and Nintendo both messing up, seemingly both falling for the third console curse. While Microsoft began to focus on media consumption while previewing a gaming machine, they made an even bigger anti-consumer move by initially planning to release the Xbox One as a always online machine that wouldn't even play a game without an internet connection. Sony was presumably able to avoid making this kind of judgment and making the PS4 a multimedia machine because they manufactured TV and media playing devices. At the time, they were probably able to use that information to focus the PS4 properly, and they saw that making a multimedia device was not going to be worth it, hence their focus on just the games. This led to one of the funniest ads I have ever seen with Sony showing instructions for sharing games with friends involving handing off a game to a friend. Nintendo Wii U was just a disaster between the lack of power, use of PowerPC architecture that was different from the x86 architecture used in the other two consoles, making it hard to port games, and the gimmick of a gamepad no one could figure out a practical use for. In my opinion, of all of these, PowerPC as the architecture was the oddest choice. Companies typically consult developers about what they want in future hardware, hence the similarities in Xbox and PS4 architecture. Why they decided not to go with this is uncertain. Now, some of you would say this isn't Nintendo's third console, and you're right, it's their third console. Let's see who gets to that reference. Now we get to the 9th gen of PS5, Xbox Series X, and Switch, where Sony kinda had a problem. Scalpers. This, in my opinion, is where Sony had to change their minds with regards to exclusivity and may very well have to be ready to eventually get out of hardware manufacturing altogether. Now, on paper, this doesn't sound like it should mess up the company that bad. The scalpers buy their machines, the scalpers resell it, and Sony get their money either way. They get to pump up their stock price by saying they sold X number of PS5s this quarter, but as is often the case in business, long-term benefits were sacrificed for short-term gains. Now, consoles have historically been sold at a bit of a loss. Take into account the cost of manufacturing, advertising and shipping, then the recouping of the R&D costs for the current console, and getting money for the R&D cost for the next console that will be released. And we can assume a $50 to $100 loss per model. Console makers make $7 per each game that is sold, with the rest going to developers, assuming the retail price. Now, I have no hard data on how many games the average PlayStation 5 owner has, but using the averages on about the PS4, it averages out to about 10 games. Take into account services and assuming the average gamer buys 2 full price games a year, and they roughly make back their profits after the average console cycle is done in about 5 years. Now, with scalpers hoarding the PS5 as much as they have been, Sony has effectively been selling less games per console than they have ever been. It's hard to gauge how many PS5s are just sitting in some scalper's home or warehouse waiting to be sold. About the closest we have is an educated guess. A Medium article from 2021 guessing it's about 25% based on the triggering of an achievement in Astro's Playroom. While this is not a perfect approximation and makes a few assumptions like everyone who has a PS5 has played this game and only one person per the console, this seems like a reasonable calculation. Now, if that number is correct, that means that the average console gamer would need about 3 more games per person for Sony to make back their money. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but let's not forget that's an average of $180 to $210 per person, depending if the $60 or $70 price tag sticks. No, used games don't count because the console manufacturers don't make a profit on used games, so it's arguably that number needs to be even higher. Now, some may say they also need to recoup the cost of making the video games. However, some simple math would show they usually remake the money on most big first-party titles. Spider-Man, Last of Us, and Uncharted are all estimated to have cost $100 million. Even if you add $20 million for advertising, they are making back most of their money with the sale of about 1.7 million copies. Now, this sounds like a lot of sales, but when you take into account each of these have sold tens of millions, then it puts a better perspective on the sales. So what is one to do when they can move hardware but can't sell software? Release the software on other platforms in an attempt to make back their money. Worst case, if they have to leave the console market altogether, they have an exit strategy. This move isn't distinct to Sony either. Arguably, this is part of the reason Microsoft has done it too, as they are not immune to the scalping issue either. Microsoft is a different beast altogether because of the large sums of money they have. Keep in mind their acquisition of Activision cost $69 billion, just $2 billion shy of what Disney spent buying Fox Studios in 2019. The thing with Microsoft, though, is that they are able to try all ways to succeed while tanking the losses until the dust settles. Sony, on the other hand, is essentially a husk of what they used to be, being propped up by their film and PlayStation divisions. So if they don't make something work, they are going to lose money. So why don't they release their games on each other's platforms? Well, outside of pre-existing contracts like Minecraft on PS4, it's a matter of audience. Consoles are locked down devices. It's a walled garden business model. While PC gaming is not a walled garden. It's more like a forest. Much like how people like to go to parks and people who like to go camping aren't the same person, the person who is into console gaming wants a walled garden. A walled garden with no doors on the walls so they can't get out, and as a result they can't mess up their device. Not easily anyways. The console companies don't really consider it the same market. Though in my opinion this is an oversight because with things like the Steam Deck you're getting a walled garden with a door leading into the forest. A best of both worlds scenario. This lack of sales is the source of all the price increases with Sony. This is the reason why they rose the price of the PS5 $100 in almost every region. They're at a point in the console generation where they need to make back their money, and they have found that the PS5 hasn't sold the average amount of software they were expecting. Or at least that's the impression I've gotten. This is also why they've done 3 tiers of their subscription service. Any way to make up those losses. Though raising the price may cause them to sell less, they are still able to make back losses at the higher price. Now they say it's due to inflation and supply constraints, but this just makes for a good cover to make decisions that bump up their bottom line. To think this could have all been avoided if they regulated how many PS5s a person could buy. The same goes for games. While they aren't the only ones attempting to raise the baseline price of games, they have the biggest incentive since they can bump up the percent of money they make per game sales, and it falls in line with this sell less, make more profit model. Don't get me wrong, Microsoft and Nintendo are not above doing this move themselves. They are probably just waiting to see how the market responds to these moves before they suddenly have a supply chain issue. At the end of the day, if it's shown to be profitable, they will attempt to do it themselves. So yes, it appears that Sony is releasing all games on PC to make back all the money they are losing on the PS5, with the added benefit of giving them a contingency plan in the event they have to stop making consoles. For all of you who may not be able to believe in a world where Sony no longer makes a PS5, I would like to remind you there was a world where people couldn't believe Sega stopped making hardware either. What do I foresee happening? Who knows? If I could predict the future, I would be a rich man. Though I doubt they would go away, I can see a world where Sony is just a game publisher that makes a nice controller and sells their software on third parties. In general, the console industry appears to be heading in a direction where the big console makers sell software and not hardware, but with the focus on streaming services and all the developer and publisher acquisitions that are occurring regularly. Whatever ends up happening, I know it'll be very interesting.